Hello, and welcome to week 71 of our 2-year Bible study. We're in the midst of Daniel this week, and we took a look at Daniel 1 during our last session, where Daniel is, through faithfulness to God, is given an opportunity to serve in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. And in Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, but the astrologers are unable to know what the dream is and interpret it. I think Nebuchadnezzar is a bit on to his wise men, and so he tells them that they must determine what the dream was and then interpret the dream, which, of course, the advisors are like, nobody's ever done this. We can't do this. We don't know what goes on in your head. And so he gets angry at the wise men and is ready to kill them all. Daniel hears about this, prays to God that God would give him both the dream and interpretation of the dream, and then goes to Nebuchadnezzar and says that he is able to tell Nebuchadnezzar what he saw in his dream. And notice in verse 27, Daniel replies, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he is asked about, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries." Notice how Daniel gives credit to God for what he's about to do, both tell the king what his dream was as well as interpret it. And so the dream is of this giant statue, and the nations that are listed, or the nations that are represented here, are Babylon. Babylon is the head of the statue. And then Persia is its chest and arms. And then Greece is its belly and thigh. And then Rome is the legs and the toes. But there's this boulder, this stone, rolls down the mountain and destroys the statue. And Jesus is the stone that is greater than them all. And so this is a statement of God's greatness, especially through his Messiah, which is what the stone represents, through Jesus being greater than all the nations. On Daniel 3, apparently that statue that was in Nebuchadnezzar's dream got the best of him, because he creates a statue of himself. And I think the statue that he's creating that has to be worshipped is related to the dream. Nebuchadnezzar wants people to worship him instead of the one that is greater than the statue, the stone. And so he really missed the whole point of the dream. He saw the head being Babylon, and him being the head of that statue, and all of that went to his own head, as opposed to being awed and fearful of the stone that destroys that statue. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are friends of Daniel, and they will not bow down to the statue because they won't worship a false idol. And Nebuchadnezzar says he's going to throw them into the furnace. And in verse 17, they say, "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." They are both they have expectation that God is going to rescue them, but they have no agenda. In other words, they're not saying God must rescue them. They're not certain of the outcome, but they are certain of who God is. And they're certain that God can rescue them if he desires to, but that if he desires not to, but they are still going to be faithful to God. And so this idea of expectation without agenda, I think, is an important approach to the way that we think of God's power and his use of power in our lives. We should expect him to act powerfully, but we should not set an agenda that God must act in a particular way in order for us to worship him and glorify him well. In verse 25, Nebuchadnezzar looks at them while they're in the furnace, and he says, "Look, I see 4 men walking around the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the fourth looks like the son of the gods. I believe that this is a pre-incarnate theophany of Jesus. And it's interesting, I think, that Nebuchadnezzar had set up a way to watch the torture. Like, this is just how debased this particular king is. But I think he sees Jesus. Jesus is in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and walking around and talking and kind of not affected in any way by the fire. Even when they're taken out of the fire, there's no smell of smoke on them. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are promoted. And certainly Nebuchadnezzar has this encounter with God through them. Well, in Daniel chapter 4, we see that Nebuchadnezzar has the whole chapter is actually talking about this experience that he had and the dream that he had. And notice Nebuchadnezzar's recognition of the Holy Spirit here. In verse 8, it said, finally, Daniel came into my presence. I told him the dream. He is called Belshazzar after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. So Nebuchadnezzar misunderstands who the Holy Spirit is, but he does recognize the Holy Spirit being on Daniel. And so Daniel proclaims the revelation to Nebuchadnezzar, what the dream means, even though it's difficult. Verse 19, then Daniel, also called Belshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. So Daniel proclaims this to Nebuchadnezzar, and sometimes we as believers are required to be in difficult places where we need to say difficult things, but truthful things to the people around them. So the dream is finally fulfilled 12 months later due to the pride of Nebuchadnezzar. He begins to act like an animal in the field. And certainly, I think we could say that this judgment is coming because of the pride that he had in the statue. Certainly, he recognizes his own power and glory and the pride there. Verse 30 specifically ties it to his own pride. Is not this the great Babylon I have built as a royal residence by my mighty power for the glory of my majesty? And so rather than recognizing that God is the one who puts kings in places, Nebuchadnezzar thinks of this as his own doing, and thus probably tied to the pride of the statue that he built as well. And by the time we get to the end of this particular passage in verse 34, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven. My sanity was restored, and then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. And then there's a verse and a half of a song here. Nebuchadnezzar seems to have a genuine conversion experience here, where he really does recognize the true God and worship him in an appropriate way. As we get to Daniel chapter 5, we're getting to the end of Babylon's rule. So this is one of the sons of Nebuchadnezzar who's ruling at this point. Daniel still has some influence, although it seems to be minimized in Belshazzar's kingdom. And verse 11 says, there is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. So Daniel seems to have fallen out of favor with Nebuchadnezzar's son because Belshazzar needs to be told who Daniel is. He doesn't know him personally. And the king says that he'll pay Daniel in order to explain what the handwriting on the wall is. And Daniel answers in verse 17, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Daniel wants nothing for himself, especially if he already knows the meaning of the writing. If he knows looking at the wall what the meaning of it is, there's no need for him to have anything. Persia is about to take over. And in verse 22, notice it says, but you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. In other words, Belshazzar was familiar through Nebuchadnezzar of who the Most High God was. And rather than humbling himself before God, he instead lived pridefully. So there's a greater responsibility for Nebuchadnezzar's son to act appropriately because Belshazzar, knew the truth of who God was. Well, in Daniel chapter 6, we have shifted over into the Persian Empire, and Daniel's still influential in this new empire, but has people who are against him, and they contrive a way for him to be thrown into the den of lions. Notice Daniel does not attempt to hide his devotion to God. In verse 10, it says, now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. So he does this with open windows, same time of day. He's not trying to hide anything here. And he's probably praying to Jerusalem based on Solomon's prayer in 1 Kings 8, verse 48, where Solomon says, if the people have been taken to another country and they pray to the temple, so to the presence of God, that God would hear their prayers and rescue them. Daniel had clearly an impression on Darius, because Darius actually tries to save Daniel's life and it really makes mention of God as part of his parting blessing. In verse 16, it says, may your God whom you serve continually rescue you. So Daniel already has had some pretty significant influence on Darius. This also seems like a genuine worship of God. Notice how knowledge of God keeps rippling out in the book. The guard comes to understand who God is. Nebuchadnezzar comes to know who God is. His household, certainly his son at least, knew who true God was. And certainly Darius, and eventually by the end of the chapter, all of Persia, as Darius sends a decree out to the entire of Persia. This is one man's influence in the place where God has put him. And we should not be surprised when God works similarly in our own lives for us to be able to be a good influence and representative of God in the places that he's given us. In Daniel chapter 7, Daniel has a dream of 4 beasts. And in verse 12, it says that the other beasts have been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. So these beasts are nations, and then in verse 13 it says, "In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man." This is the title most used by Jesus of himself. But not necessarily the context. So in verse 14, it says, he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So that's how Jesus thought of himself when he's using this particular phrase. So Jesus is, of course, not looking back at the nations that have come before, but looking forward to his own kingdom, which is represented in these verses. The lion, as we get to an interpretation of the dream, the lion equals Babylon. And the lion is standing on his feet. And some have suggested this kind of represents the conversion of Nebuchadnezzar. The bear equals Medo-Persia, the leopard equals Greece, and the beast equals Rome. really difficult to identify the 10 horns. These are probably kings, but they're probably not successive kings. Also, the prophecy does not indicate how the little horn overtakes three of them. So it's kind of so certainly there is a sense in which this little horn in some way overthrows or takes over the other three horns, but it's not really clear as to how. Likely, these 10 horns represent nations that come out of the Roman Empire, with the Antichrist, the little horn, coming from within one of those nations. When we get to Daniel chapter 8, this is a vision of Persia and Greece that ends with a ruler named Antiochus Epiphanes. Chapter 8 is one of the primary reasons why people believe that Daniel needs to have been written much later. I believe it was written during the early Persian Empire, that God, of course, knows the future and is able to indicate these details, but these details are so accurate to what actually happened that for skeptics, it's very hard for them to believe that this is something that could have been proclaimed prior to the event. But we believe that God is capable of doing that, of course, as we've seen throughout the rest of the prophets. And so we are not surprised to see him doing it here. In Daniel chapter 9, we see that Daniel is praying to God. And in verse 2, it says, "In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood from the scriptures, according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet, that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years." Notice that Jeremiah is already considered canonical by the time of Daniel. So this is later in Daniel's life, but certainly before the end of the exile, Jeremiah, who during the time of his prophetic role was not considered a true prophet by most of the people, because he said God's going to destroy Jerusalem. But once Jerusalem is destroyed, it seems as though they have come to recognize Jeremiah as a true prophet quite early. Also, as Daniel prays, it's interesting to me that Daniel includes himself with the national sin. We oftentimes are not communal enough in our thinking to want to do that. We think of confessing personal sins, but I think we are responsible for the sins of our culture, that we can, that much like Daniel, we can be praying and asking for forgiveness for. In verses 18 and 19, we see just the depth of Daniel's remorse and passion. In verse 18, Daniel says, "Give ear, our God, and hear. Open your eyes and see the desolation of the city that bears your name. We do not make requests of you because we are righteous, but because of your great mercy. Lord, listen. Lord, forgive. Lord, hear and act. For your sake, my God, do not delay, because your city and your people bear your name." So Daniel is quite passionate about what he is asking God to do here. In verse 24, it talks about 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So 77s would be 490, and the 77s are being talked about here is 490 years, which, if you take the approximate time of when Daniel is receiving this vision, places its fulfillment in the time of Jesus. And certainly when we read through what is accomplished at the end of those 77s, to finish transgression, put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Place there could certainly be the temple, but I think that clearly that Jesus declares himself really the temple, the most holy place. And so it's in his death and resurrection that these are all accomplished in the ministry of Jesus. As we move on to Daniel chapter 10, Daniel has a vision of a man We know by the third year of Cyrus that people are already returning to Israel. We know that from Ezra 1, verse 1. And so the man that Daniel has a vision of is likely Gabriel or another high ranking angel. It doesn't seem to be Jesus, since the prince or the angel of Persia can delay him. And we would not expect that an angel would be able to delay Jesus in any kind of physical or spiritual movement. So likely this is Gabriel or another high-ranking angel. And I think it's important for us to recognize, as we've said, before, that sometimes in the spiritual realm there are delays, and sometimes, well, always, these are part of God allowing those delays to occur. I don't doubt that God could have sent Gabriel directly to Daniel without having to be delayed by the prince of Persia, but God allowed that to happen. And in the midst of it, Daniel continues to pray, continues to fast, continues to seek God. And so there are spiritual components that are happening in Daniel's life while that delay is happening as well. In Daniel 11, this chapter follows in detail the empire of Greece, and again, Antiochus Epiphanes. And again, this also, much like the earlier chapters, another chapter that, for those who are skeptical, is just too detailed to actual history for them to believe that that it could have been written prior to it. And yet, again, we see that God knows the future, and when the future comes to fulfillment, is an indication that He is the only true God. It proves God's sovereignty, certainly over all things, not the least of which the ancient empires. On Daniel chapter 12, we seem to have skipped forward in between chapter 11 and chapter 12 to the final judgment. And we see in verse 2, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. So here we have resurrection being talked about. And the events surrounding it are sealed, but will be understood in that time. So verses 9 and 10, it says, "Go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed unto the time of the end. Many will be purified, made spotless, and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand." I don't think that's intended to suggest that we are going to understand what is sealed prior to its happening, but when it begins to happen, when those seals begin to be broken, when the events that are sealed up in this scroll begin to take place, then those who are wise will be able to understand what is happening in their time. So as we read through the book of Daniel, Daniel's purpose seems to be a wider and wider reach of God's sovereign knowledge of the future, starting with the guard that Daniel speaks with, Nebuchadnezzar, then all of Persia, then all the Roman Empire, and pretty much all the earth. And so really this is a prophecy in some ways to us as well. Throughout the prophets, the point of accurate prophecy is rarely about accuracy. It's presumed that things are going to happen the way that God says they're going to happen. Instead, the accuracy points to God as being the only sovereign God who should be worshipped. And so Daniel, with all of its detailed accuracy, is a statement from God to both Israel and to the world that He is the only one who is to be worshipped.